Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. I am happy to be back with you. Last week we finished up chapter 2, and we were able to draw some loose correlations to what was happening with the Great Migration with what is happening currently. And I invited you all to sit with that, and I hope that you've been able to sit with it, get some grounding with some thinking, and hopefully prompt some journal prompts too to help you along the way with your current journey into decolonizing and anti-racism work. We are going to pick up today with chapter 3, Burning Brown to the Ground. If you're reading along, chapter 3 starts on page 67, and we'll jump into it. Jim Crow dominated the lives of Black people in America from 1890 well into the 20th century. From conception to coffin, there was no nook or cranny from a Black person's life that it did not touch. In the early 1930s, under the direction of brilliant legal tactician Charles Hamilton Houston, the NAACP launched a campaign in the courts to destroy Jim Crow and overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that had made separate but equal the legal cornerstone of racial segregation in America. When the U.S. Supreme Court first announced that 1896 decision, the states had seized on the separate aspect of the edict almost immediately, instituting racially distinct facilities from telephone booths to cemeteries. For nearly 6 decades, the same states had consistently failed to provide anything approximating equal for America's Black citizens. This was the Achilles heel that the NAACP's legal team attacked. The association's initial thrust was to force the states to equalize educational opportunities, as Plessy required, insisting they finance, create, and maintain Black law schools and doctoral programs of the same caliber as the ones labeled whites only. White Southern leaders tried to parry the NAACP's challenge and still meet Plessy's threshold. Texas attempted to recreate the University of Texas at Austin's law school for Black students in a rundown off-site basement, and as far as the justices could tell, failed miserably. Missouri opted to define equal as paying for African Americans to get their legal education in Nebraska or Iowa. The U.S. Supreme Court would have none of it and ordered the University of Missouri to open its doors to African Americans. They tried to have them go to different states. Oklahoma hoped to keep Plessy intact by admitting Blacks to its flagship university, but then creating apartheid-like separate spaces on campus for them. But that hardly constituted equal. As the justices noted, and they ruled that those internal racial barriers were unconstitutional. Those results were not surprising. The states couldn't possibly build two comparable systems. But if they really wanted Jim Crow, the NAACP began to make painfully clear they would have to pay for it. Already, Jim Crow had cost Americans' Black children dearly. Delaware, a border state, had abdicated all responsibility for education of its African American citizens. Blacks were pretty much left to their own devices as far as education was concerned. By 1910, they had built 81 schools throughout Delaware, but given their lack of resources, there were no more than shacks without decent lighting, plumbing, or enough desks. Even when philanthropist Pierre St. Dupont launched a program to bring these schools up to code, white residents made it clear that they not only opposed public funding for Black schools, but were equally resistant to private philanthropic resources intervening as well. So opposed to the funding for the Black schools, but then also opposed to philanthropists deciding to step in, removing all resources, whether publicly or privately. The results were devastating. There was only one Black public high school in the entire state. As a consequence, by 1950, African American adults in Delaware had finished, on average, only 7.2 years of school. Whites had finished more than 10 years. Only 505 Blacks in the entire state had earned at least a bachelor's degree. Not surprisingly, African Americans' income was barely 1/3 of white families' earnings. Virginia, despite being the wealthiest southern state and the 5th richest in the entire nation, with a constitution and statutes requiring the provision of public schools and compulsory attendance, was equally determined not to educate its Black population. In Prince Edward County, for example, no high school existed for Blacks until 1939, And by 1947, Robert Moton High was, quote, jammed with more than twice the number of students it was designed to hold. White residents, however, refused to use their tax dollars to relieve the overcrowding, ignoring the fact that 45% of the county's population was composed of African Americans, who had clearly contributed to the public till as well. Instead, to handle the overflow at Moton High, the all-white school board erected 3 tar paper shacks with neither insulation nor electricity to house the students. One teenager remembered visitors taking pictures of the shacks to, quote, show the people back home how backward we were. An elementary school for African American children, quote, a one-room wooden schoolhouse that housed 7 grades, end quote, was no better. The other Black schools in Prince Edward County, too, were poorly constructed with no indoor plumbing and thus serviced only by outhouses. The 15 facilities for 2,000 African American students were valued at $330,000, whereas the 7 brick schoolhouses for 1,400 white students, replete with indoor toilet facilities and modern furnaces, had been appraised at $1.2 million. In the Deep South, the educational opportunities were at least as bleak. The disparity in student-to-teacher ratios in mid-1930s Atlanta, for example, was staggering. For Blacks, there were 82 students for every teacher, while the ratio for whites was 35-1. The overcrowding led to significantly shortened school days as African American students rotated through on staggered, truncated shifts. Even when public funding was finally increased, the disparities not only remained, but also actually grew. In 1942, the Atlanta School Board allocated $75 more in support per capita for white students than for Black students. By 1946, that figure had climbed to a difference of almost $80. African Americans had to contend with overcrowded classrooms, decrepit school buildings, inadequate numbers of textbooks, schools lacking libraries, cafeterias, gymnasiums, and double and triple sessions where 85% of all Black elementary school students attended class for only half the day during the 1947 to 1948 school year. In Louisiana, during the 1933 to 1944 academic year, similar funding disparities echoed throughout the school system. At the elementary level alone, for example, the East Baton Rouge Parish spent $67.79 per capita on white children, while doling out a mere third of that for each African American student. Orleans Parish spent $103.65 on each white elementary school student and $66.76 on each Black student. East Feliciana Parish, 30 miles north of Baton Rouge, had a per capita allocation of $121.64 for whites in kindergarten through 6th grades, and a paltry $18.92 for each Black child in those grades. Overall, Louisiana spent $76.34 per white elementary school child and only $23.99 for each African American one. Real quick, to go with what we've been reading so far, and even just in this chapter alone, to read this, it is virtually impossible to understand that this racism is a systemic issue. It goes beyond, again, just the violent names or the violent acts. It's systemic in the fact that the education of children was so overwhelmingly underfunded, and they were so overwhelmingly unable to attend school in full days. And then what turns around in response to that is that Black children are identified as lazy or uneducated, but negating the fact that there were the systemic issues with the education of Black children. I spoke the other day on TikTok with a video about the question behind the question and how we get to where we are and the acts that get us there. And so when you have those conversations, or we see those conversations where Black people and Black children especially are identified as uneducated or unable to learn or have the inability to learn, I want you to remember, I want you to think back to this chapter right now and think from the 1930s on, the specific and intentional steps that were taken to keep the education away from Black children. Like we discussed earlier in this chapter, they didn't want public funding for the Black schools, but they also didn't want philanthropists to provide funding for the schools, a systemic issue. South Carolina was just as discriminatory. In the early 1950s, the state spent nearly 5 times more per capita on school buildings for whites than it did on those for Blacks, had no high school whatsoever for African Americans in 19 counties, and assigned only 8 school buses throughout the state to transport Black children. In Clarendon County, there were 30 school buses for the white children, none for the Black children. And when in 1947, a soft-spoken Black preacher asked the all-white school board for just one bus, the chairman, R.W. Eliot, fired back, quote, "We ain't got no money to buy a bus for your nigger children," end quote. Yet they had funds to educate white students. The property value of Black schools in Clarendon County, attended by 6,531 students, was, quote, officially listed as $194,575. The value of the white schools, attended by 2,375 youngsters, was put at $673,850, end quote. Thus, the county spent nearly 10 times more per capita on the white students' facilities. The result of such widespread disparities in funding was that the U.S. educational system, despite the demands of parents and students craving high-quality schools, had deliberately produced a sprawling, uneducated population that would bedevil the nation well into the 21st century. Got there without realizing we were going to get there. In Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, with a combined population of 4.7 million African Americans, more than half of all Black adults by the 1940s had less than 5 years of formal education. In South Carolina and Louisiana, more than 60% of Black adult citizens had no more than a 4th or 5th grade education. In one court case after the next from 1935 to 1950, the NAACP had convincingly demonstrated that Southern governments were simply incapable of meeting Plessy's Jim Crow standard of separate but equal. And because the legal bedrock of the South was predicated on that dictum, the proven inability to have both equal and separate simultaneously left Dixie in judicial danger, which was just as Charles Hamilton Houston intended. With the legal precedent duly laid, the time to take down Plessy as fundamentally unconstitutional was now. Houston's protege, Thurgood Marshall, led the next phase of this legal battle. Starting in 1950, the NAACP's lawyers had amassed cases from Delaware, Virginia, South Carolina, Kansas, and Washington, D.C. that were bundled into one, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. In 1952, Marshall argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that racial segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th, as well as the Due Process Clause of the 5th Amendment. And with that, a series of legal, political, and cultural explosions went off below the Mason-Dixon line. It was clear that Jim Crow in the classroom was fast approaching a fatal constitutional rendezvous, something white Southern politicians were determined to avoid at all costs. This legal challenge was no surprise. Every legislator, senator, congressman, and governor knew that the schools designed for Black children were woefully inadequate and had been so for generations. As Roy Wilkins, executive secretary of the NAACP, explained, quote, "By any fair calculation, governors and school boards had had nearly 20 years to see the train coming down the track. It just didn't roll up to them overnight," end quote. There were signs. The association's first lawsuit had been in 1935 against the University of Maryland, followed by cases against Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. Therefore, Wilkins wrote, quote, "It should have been obvious that change in the high school and grade schools was coming next," end quote. As they had previously attempted with higher education, the states then dangled a series of school equalization packages before the NAACP and the Black community as a bribe to drop the lawsuits and accept separate schools as reality in America. President Dwight Eisenhower sympathized with the white South. At the behest of his great friend, South Carolina Governor James Burns, Eisenhower hosted a small dinner party at the White House to explain to Chief Justice Earl Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big overgrown Negroes. At the same time, he warned Governor Burns the last minute Southern attempt to put some money into Negro schools would be prohibitively expensive. During World War II, the federal government estimated that it would have taken in 2014 dollars 1.2 trillion to equalize the schools in America. Burns and others, however, believed the expense was worth it to keep Jim Crow the uncontested law of the land. And so, as a gesture of good faith, new black high schools suddenly popped up across the South, while property tax bonds earmarked for black schools sailed through, or at least earnestly discussed, in all white legislators. That was a carrot. The NAACP, however, refused to bite. Those new schools, quote, gilded citadels of segregation, end quote, the association called them, were but a sorcerer's trick in the struggle for real equality. Politicians who had ignored or deliberately strangled Black children's opportunities for decades had not miraculously experienced a change of heart. Only the NAACP's steady stream of victories in court had caused this sudden loosening of the wallet, and this all too recent concern about the overcrowded shacks called schools. African Americans had no doubt that the moment the association backed off, underlying assumptions of Black inferiority and inability would reemerge and continue to translate into public policy, and not just in the schools, but also in housing, employment, healthcare, and the vote. So neither the NAACP nor the Black community backed down or backed off. Roy Wilkins scoffed at white Southern leaders scrambled to upgrade Black school shanties in the vain hope of heading off pressure to do away with them entirely. The future was at stake here, and African Americans were determined to use every resource at their disposal to ensure that not one more generation fell into the abyss of illiteracy, poverty, and economic vulnerability. I offered my life for a decadent democracy, pronounced the Reverend L. Francis Griffin, a Black man who had served in the Jim Crow military during World War II and had been one of the firebrands in Prince Edward County behind Brown. Quote, and I'm willing to die rather than let those children down, end quote. For those whites who had hoped that equalization would diffuse the Armageddon of Brown, that kind of trenchant response was as terrifying as it was surprising. When it was clear that the carrot wouldn't work, and when even once reliable Negroes whom the power structure had always been able to count on to preach patience actually refused to lend their support to equalization schemes to convince the NAACP to withdraw Brown from the Supreme Court's docket, then the response was emphatic. Senator James O. Eastland, a Democrat from Mississippi, vowed, "We will protect and maintain white supremacy throughout eternity." Mississippi Governor Fielding Wright concurred, adding, quote, regardless of the consequences. In Georgia, beating back a 1949 challenge from Black parents to equalize the schools, Governor Herman Talmadge had already proposed a constitutional amendment that would authorize the state legislature to scrap the public school system altogether and, quote, channel state funds into tuition grants for white students attending private schools, end quote. In other words, while threatening to scuttle public education and provide state-funded tuition for whites to attend segregated private academies, Talmadge, who had vowed, quote, as long as I am governor, Negroes will not be admitted to white schools, end quote, never contemplated any educational alternatives for the 321,255 African-American children in the state in 1950. Similarly, Mississippi's legislature crafted a constitutional amendment to abolish public schools. And in case that didn't pass, a pupil placement law using race-neutral language, quote, ability, whether a good fit or not, to give school boards inordinate power to prevent more than 325,000 Black children from gaining access to better resourced white schools. In South Carolina, Burns, who had been a congressman, a U.S. senator, a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and then Secretary of State before becoming governor, added, quote, added dignity and a sense of solemn purpose to the segregationist cause, end quote. The aura of respectability he lent to a slew of legislative proposals, selling public school property to private individuals, pupil placement laws, and, quote, a constitutional amendment relieving South Carolina of its obligation to provide a free public school system, end quote, made them seem the work of reasonable, learned statesmen. Of only one thing we can be certain, he swore. South Carolina will not now, nor for some years to come, mix white and colored children in our schools, end quote. Even if, he continued, that meant shutting down the entire school education system, he was willing to shut down the school education system to avoid having Black students go to school with white students. That's a level of hatred. Similar reactions spread throughout the South and threatened to erupt more seriously in the event that the Supreme Court ruled Plessy and therefore Jim Crow unconstitutional. That day of reckoning came. After nearly 60 years of racial purgatory, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown that Jim Crow schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and in the D.C. case, the due process requirement of the 5th Amendment. Even the taciturn Royal Wilkins could barely contain himself. Quote, May 17, 1954 was one of life's sweetest days, he later recalled. Nor was the significance of this judgment confined to the education of Black children. If segregation is unconstitutional in educational institutions, observed Charles Johnson, president of Fisk University, it is no less so unconstitutional in other aspects of our national life. At that moment, it appeared that true citizenship, might finally be at hand for African Americans. It was, quote, the greatest victory for the Negro people since the Emancipation Proclamation, end quote, wrote the New York Amsterdam News. Robert Jackson, a Black professor in Virginia, exclaimed that, quote, a heavy burden has been lifted from Black students' shoulders. They see a new world opening up for them and those that follow. We're going to stop there. If you're reading along, we're stopping on page 75. Finish the first paragraph. A few years back, I want to say maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Topeka, Kansas. I went there for a diversity council meeting for a company that I worked for, and I got to tour one of the museum of the Brown versus the Board of Education, and got to see what some of the classrooms looked like, and see some images from students going to school. And one of the things that I learned while I was there is that while the Black students had these decrepit schools, while the Black students had the longest routes to school, we're talking they would have to walk 5 miles to get to the bus stop, and then take the bus into school, and then have school, but then have to take the bus back and walk another 5 miles home. I mean, these children were just going through the most of education, but they would go to these rundown schools with these rundown books and have everything dilapidated and falling apart. However, the educators that they did have at a lot of times were more educated than the white teachers. They had more schooling when they were able to get to schooling. So as much as they was trying to keep Black children from learning, they couldn't keep educated teachers out of the schools, which again goes to the sustainability and the way that Black people are so resilient when it comes to taking everything away from us. We will find a way. But the people that were willing to let the school system go to shit, essentially, the people that were willing to say, forget the whole school system, I'm not going to have Black students with white students, are similar to the same people today. And even here would fight, it's about the kids. But if we take those people and place them today, those are going to be the same people that you will hear in government saying, we have to protect the kids. It's the kids first. But what they mean is the white kids. Just like in that line where they were worried about their white daughters being next to overgrown Negroes. The adultification of Black children that just aren't considered children because they're the same age. Systemic racism is an insidious act that trickles out in so many ways. Systemic racism, environmental racism, educational racism, employment racism. It has many offshoots of it. And right now we're talking on the education, but it's so important. And I want you all to think about this. And I want this to be the journal prompt when you hear those moments, or when you've had those moments of, let's say, some bias that you might not even recognize, where you see a Black child and a white child, and you might think the Black child is older than what the white child is. Or if you think the Black child might be delayed for some reason, that first thought, if that is your first thought that comes in your mind, that is bias that has been placed into your head based on and due to systemic racism, we can acknowledge that. We can acknowledge that that bias comes from some place. It does not just appear. It is brought to you by something that you've heard, something that you've been taught, something that you've been told. And my hope is, as we continue reading this, is that you understand that a lot of the bias comes from the thoughts from the days of enslavement. My journal prompt for you all today with this book is to think about ways that you have seen your implicit bias show up when it comes to looking at Black children versus white children. Think about the ways that you have potentially placed some adultification on Black children. Think about the ways that you have potentially looked at a Black child and a white child and saw a white child but a Black person, or a little white girl and a Black man, a young Black man. I've seen 9-year-olds referred to as young Black men. Those are children. Those are children. But look at the ways that you've seen that your biases have shown up, and then take it a step further. Where did that come from? Where did that thought process, where did that biases come from? Because it came from somewhere. And again, referring back to that video with the question behind the question, if you can identify the bias, if you can identify the bias that you have, and then you can identify where that bias came to you or how you got to that point, and then you can identify what got them to that point, then you can identify what needs to change, what thought process, what along that path needs to change. You can't go back and change it, but you can make sure that you don't repeat it going forward. Because if you have people around you, especially if you have children around you, there's a likelihood that some of the bias that has been passed down to you has been passed down to them. And this can be a point that you can stop that pattern. Find the root cause. Find the root place of what got you to where you are right now, or what you've been thinking about. There has to be a reason. If you're with me here reading this book, there's likely a reason for it, that you want to decolonize, that you are working on anti-racism. And in order to do that, not only do you have to recognize what your North Star is and what you're working towards, you have to recognize what you're unlearning. You cannot unlearn something until you identify what it is that you need to let go of. Thank you for reading along with me again today. This was reading that chapter, reading that specific portion about the description. I want to go back to it again real quick. It's on page 72. Southerners are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. It's about the kids. Okay, you have your journal prompts. Think about the bias. Think about where it came from. Think about who taught it to you. And then think about what you're going to do. Journal, really sit with, what are you going to do to release yourself from that bias thinking? What are you going to do to ensure that it stops with you? I appreciate you all. Be gentle with yourselves. And I will see you next week.